Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the cold wind of the North Sea brushing against your face, a sound between a whisper and a roar. The year is around 800 AD, and longships glide through the mist like phantoms. On their decks stand men with eyes as sharp as their axes, the Norsemen, raiders from the icy coasts of Scandinavia. No one then could have imagined that these fierce wanderers would one day become kings, scholars, and builders of empires. The story of the Normans begins in fire and fear, born from the chaos of Viking raids that shattered the quiet monasteries of the early Middle Ages. Yet, from those raids came something far more lasting than pillage, a culture of adaptation. When the Viking leader Rollo and his men settled along the fertile valleys of northern France, they did not just take the land, they let the land take them. They learned the language of the Franks, adopted their religion, and soon their children were no longer called Norsemen, but Normans, the Northmen who had become something new. This transformation was slow, quiet, and almost invisible, like frost spreading across stone. But underneath that calm, something powerful was forming, a fusion of warrior instinct and administrative brilliance. Rollo's descendants began to rule not merely with the sword, but with law, alliance, and faith. They built fortresses, founded towns, and transformed their duchy into one of the most sophisticated states in medieval Europe. The Normans had learned that true conquest was not only about land, it was about legacy. Some historians say they were the most adaptable of all medieval peoples, able to shift from Viking raiders to Christian rulers with astonishing speed. Others believe it was the constant need for survival that forged their discipline, their cold brilliance, their ambition to control not just kingdoms, but the idea of power itself. The mists of Normandy still carry whispers of those early days of oaths made under grey skies, of ships burning on the riverbanks as a new civilization rose from their ashes. And as we move deeper into their story, we begin to see how the Normans, born of the sea, shaped by the sword, and defined by their will, would change the course of Europe forever. But first, who truly were these people beneath the armor, and what drove them to seek greatness in a world that feared their name? The dawn that broke over northern France in the 10th century brought with it something rare in medieval Europe, a fragile peace. After years of raids and burning villages, the Viking chief Rollo had been granted land by the Frankish king Charles the Simple. In exchange for defending the coast, Rollo would swear loyalty to the crown. Some say he refused to kneel during the ceremony, forcing a soldier to lift his foot and kiss it in mock submission. Others believe he did bow, reluctantly, not to a man but to opportunity. Whatever the truth, from that uneasy alliance came a duchy that would soon outshine its neighbors, Normandy. It was a land of green valleys and winding rivers, of fortresses carved from stone and wood, of people who learned to live between two worlds. The settlers mixed with the locals, creating a new race of people, half Viking, half Frankish, both restless and calculating. They spoke a new dialect, embraced Christianity with zeal, and began to build the structures of government that would later inspire kingdoms across Europe. The dukes of Normandy were no longer wandering raiders. They were rulers with laws, coins, and courts. Yet behind their civility, the spirit of the sea still lingered, a hunger for adventure, for risk, for conquest. The first Norman generations mastered the art of feudalism, rewarding loyalty with land and demanding unwavering service in return. Knights trained in their castles, bound by oaths that mixed devotion with ambition. Monks copied texts in candlelight, preserving learning that elsewhere was fading into shadow. And merchants began to move along the rivers, carrying salt, wine, and iron to distant ports. Normandy was alive with motion, a place where the pulse of war beat alongside the rhythm of trade. But power, once tasted, demands more. The Normans were never content to remain confined by their borders. Their dukes looked across the Channel toward England, south toward the Mediterranean, east toward Byzantium, always searching for the next horizon to claim. In this restless mix of faith and ferocity lay the true secret of Norman greatness. They could conquer, but they could also build. They could destroy, but they could just as easily govern. And so Normandy became the forge from which a new kind of ruler was cast, one who believed that destiny itself could be shaped by will. The question was not if they would rise, but where they would strike next. From the forests and fields of Normandy emerged a new kind of soldier, disciplined, cunning, and armored not only in steel but in ambition. The Norman knight was the embodiment of controlled aggression, a transformation of Viking ferocity into organized power. The longships had given way to war horses, and the wild freedom of the seas had been replaced by the rigid codes of feudal warfare. Each man was bound to his lord, his sword pledged by oath and by honor. But make no mistake, these were not gentle men. They trained for battle as if it were a sacred calling. At dawn, the clang of metal echoed through the mist as they practiced with spear and shield. In the courtyards of timber fortresses, pages and squires learned to mount, to strike, to fall without fear. The Normans perfected the art of cavalry, charging with lances angled like thunderbolts, a tactic that would break armies and change the face of medieval warfare. Yet beyond their martial skill lay something deeper: calculation. Norman leaders were not reckless berserkers. They were strategists. They understood the balance between terror and mercy, between conquest and governance. Their raids were planned, their fortifications methodical. They studied their enemies, Saxons, Bretons, Franks, and adapted, blending brutality with brilliance. The church, too, played its part. Bishops blessed Norman campaigns as holy endeavors, binding warfare to divine purpose. Monks chronicled their victories, casting them as instruments of God's will. The result was a powerful fusion: faith sanctified conquest, and conquest enriched faith. This dual identity made the Normans unstoppable. They could pray in the chapel 1 hour and storm a fortress the next. Their banners, often marked with the cross, became symbols of both salvation and domination. By the 11th century, Norman lords stood among the most formidable military powers in Europe. Their strongholds, wooden Matanbally castles, perched on artificial hills, sprouted like seeds of ambition across the countryside, each one a reminder that the Normans intended not just to fight, but to stay. From these towers of wood and stone, they would launch their greatest endeavor yet, an invasion across the sea that would alter the course of history forever. But before the sails were raised and the horses loaded, one man had to rise above them all: the Duke who would be called the Conqueror in the year 1028. A child was born in the ducal city of Falaise, a boy whose destiny would stretch far beyond the stone walls of Normandy. His name was William, the son of Duke Robert the Magnificent and a tanner's daughter named Herleva. His birth was branded with the mark of illegitimacy, and because of it, the nobles whispered. They called him William the Bastard. But fate has a strange way of favoring the unlikely. When his father died on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, the boy inherited a duchy divided by greed and rebellion. For years, Normandy burned with civil strife. Castles fell. Families betrayed each other. The young duke grew up among assassins and mercenaries, learning early that trust was rare and power had to be seized, not granted. As he matured, William's will hardened into something unbreakable. He was not loved, but he was feared, and in medieval politics, fear was often stronger than affection. He crushed his rivals, reclaimed his lands, and reshaped his rule into one of brutal efficiency. By the time he was 30, his control over Normandy was absolute. Yet William was not content to rule one duchy. His eyes turned toward the English Channel, toward a kingdom that shimmered with opportunity. England, across the grey waters, was fractured and uncertain. King Edward the Confessor was aging, and his succession unclear. William claimed that Edward had promised him the throne, a claim supported, perhaps conveniently, by Harold Godwinson's supposed oath of loyalty. Whether this was truth or political theatre, the moment Edward died in 1066, William moved with precision. He gathered his vassals, summoned his fleet, and called his campaign not an invasion, but a rightful claim, sanctioned, he said, by God and by justice. His army was a fusion of Norman knights, Breton infantry, and mercenaries from across Europe, all driven by the promise of land and glory. On the shores of the Channel, thousands of men stood ready beneath banners stitched with golden crosses, their armor glinting under the September sun. When the winds finally shifted, William gave the order. The ships were launched, the drums sounded, and Normandy's destiny sailed toward England. What awaited them was a single hill, a single day, and a single battle that would echo through 1,000 years, the Battle of Hastings. The morning of October 14th, 1066, began with a chill in the air and the heavy mist that rolled across the fields near Hastings. On Senlac Hill, Harold Godwinson's English army waited a wall of shields, axes, and resolve. They had marched hundreds of miles south after defeating another invader in the north, exhausted but determined to defend their homeland. Across the valley, William's Norman forces gathered in silence. The banners of Normandy fluttered above ranks of knights, archers, and infantry. The sound of priests chanting carried through the fog as William received the blessing of his men. Both sides understood what this day would mean. The crown of England hung in the balance. The battle began with the twang of bowstrings, Norman arrows hissing through the air toward the English line. But the shield wall held firm. The first Norman assaults were repelled, their cavalry breaking against the stubborn English ranks like waves against stone. Rumors spread that William himself had been killed, and panic rippled through his men. Yet the Duke appeared again, lifting his helmet for all to see, shouting that he still lived, his voice cutting through chaos like iron through smoke. Rallying his troops, he adapted his tactics. The Normans feigned retreat, drawing parts of Harold's army down the hill in pursuit. Then, in a calculated moment, they wheeled around and struck with precision. The English line began to fracture. The air filled with shouts, the clash of steel, the screams of dying men. Harold stood among his housecarls, fighting fiercely beneath his royal banner. But by the day's end, the arrow that history remembers found its mark, striking Harold down and ending Saxon rule. When the sun set over the blood-soaked hill, William stood victorious. The ground was littered with bodies, the cries of the wounded fading into the cold night. In that silence, England changed forever. The Normans had not only conquered a kingdom, they had begun to reshape an entire civilization. The wooden palisades and Saxon halls would soon give way to stone castles and cathedrals, to new laws and foreign tongues. The world that dawned after Hastings was not merely ruled by the Normans, It was reborn through them. Yet conquest was only the beginning. Ruling what they had taken would test William's strength in ways no battlefield ever could. When William entered London later that winter, the air was heavy with both smoke and submission. The city had burned in parts, the Thames shrouded in mist, as if the land itself hesitated to accept its new master. On Christmas Day of 1066, within the great stone walls of Westminster Abbey, William was crowned King of England. Yet even in triumph, the ceremony nearly descended into chaos. As the gathered crowd shouted their acclamations, Norman guards outside mistook the noise for rebellion and began setting fire to nearby houses. Flames rose in the distance as William took his oath, the echo of Latin prayers mingling with the crackle of burning wood, a coronation lit by fear and fire. England had a new ruler, but not yet a peace. The months that followed were consumed by revolt and defiance. Northern earls resisted Norman control, towns rebelled, and the shadow of Saxon vengeance crept through the forests. William's response was ruthless. He unleashed what chroniclers would later call the harrying of the North, a campaign of scorched earth and silent terror. Villages were razed, crops destroyed, entire populations left to starve through the bitter winter. The message was clear. Rebellion would not be tolerated. But brutality alone does not build empires. William balanced his iron fist with cold precision. He distributed English lands among his loyal Norman knights, ensuring that every new lord owed his power to the crown. He built castles, hundreds of them, towering symbols of dominance that scarred the landscape and cemented control. The Tower of London rose first, an unyielding monument to Norman authority. Yet William also proved himself a shrewd administrator. He kept much of the Anglo-Saxon legal framework, blending old customs with new order. His rule was not chaos, but calculated reconstruction. Within a decade, the once fractured kingdom was bound under a single, disciplined system of governance. Still, beneath the surface, resentment smoldered. The English language began to twist and change, absorbing Norman words and rhythms. The church, too, transformed under continental influence. The old world was fading, not destroyed, but rewritten. And in that quiet rewriting, William's conquest became something far greater than victory. It became legacy. But even the strongest crowns cast long shadows, and not all of William's heirs would carry his vision with the same unbreakable hand as Norman rule tightened across England. A new kind of architecture began to rise, not simply structures of defense, but instruments of control. The first Matan Bailey castles had been swift to build. Their wooden towers perched atop artificial hills, surrounded by ditches and palisades. They appeared overnight like teeth breaking through the soil, a warning to the English that rebellion would always be seen, always crushed. But Woodburn's and William's ambition demanded permanence. Stone replaced timber, and with it came the age of fortresses that still stand today: Rochester, Colchester, and the Tower of London, grim and unyielding against the grey sky. These castles were not mere shelters. They were statements. Each one announced the presence of a new order, a reminder that the conquerors were here to stay. From their high walls, Norman lords could survey villages, control trade routes, and suppress uprisings before they began. Life within was both harsh and ordered, the clatter of hooves on cobblestone, the smell of smoke and wet stone, the ever-present weight of vigilance. Yet beyond their military purpose, these castles became seeds of civilization. Around them grew towns and markets, places of worship and governance. They were centers of authority, where justice was dispensed, taxes collected, and feasts held in echoing halls lit by flickering torches. The Normans, who had once been raiders, were now builders of nations. Their architecture revealed as much about their minds as their armies did about their power, practical yet ambitious, austere yet elegant. Even the churches they raised carried the same duality, massive pillars and rounded arches, designed to awe both sinner and saint. The Romanesque style born in Normandy found new expression in English soil, where it would later evolve into Gothic majesty. But there was something darker in the stonework too, a sense that beneath the grandeur lay fear. The walls were thick, not only to repel invaders, but to keep control over a restless people. The castles stood as both homes and prisons, monuments to the uneasy peace William had carved through force. Each tower that rose higher seemed to cast a longer shadow over the land, and in those shadows, whispers began about loyalty, about rebellion, about whether England would ever truly belong to its conquerors. As the first generation of Norman lords settled into their new dominions, William turned his attention from conquest to control, from the sword to the quill. He understood that the greatest weapon of a ruler was not his army, but his knowledge. And so, in the winter of 1085, he ordered what was perhaps the most ambitious administrative project of the Middle Ages, the Domesday Book, across the kingdom. Commissioners rode through villages and manors, questioning peasants, priests, and nobles alike. They recorded every field, every ox, every fish pond and mill. Who owned the land before the conquest? Who holds it now? How many ploughs? How many men? Nothing escaped the king's gaze. By the end, the survey filled nearly 1,000 pages, a portrait of an entire nation in ink and parchment. To the common people, it was terrifying. They called it the Book of Doom, believing that its judgments were as final as those of the last day. To historians, it stands as the first great act of bureaucratic mastery in medieval Europe. But to William, it was something simpler, control rendered visible. With this book, he could tax with precision, command with authority, and understand every inch of the realm he had claimed by fire. The Domesday Book was not only a ledger, it was a declaration that England now belonged to a single, calculating mind. Yet behind this machinery of rule, daily life continued in quiet struggle. The peasants worked under the feudal system, bound to the land and their lords. The church, enriched by Norman favor, became both spiritual guide and instrument of governance. New cathedrals rose from stone, their vaults echoing with Latin hymns the few could understand. Latin replaced Old English in documents, and French became the language of courtly power. The old world of the Anglo-Saxons faded further into memory with each passing year. Still, for all his order and efficiency, William ruled with an edge of paranoia. He feared rebellion, betrayal, even his own sons. And perhaps he knew that his empire, like every empire before it, would someday turn against itself. When William died in 1087, his kingdom was left both united and divided, strong yet fragile, a realm built on ambition that would soon be tested by blood. When William the Conqueror died, his body was carried to Caen to be buried in the abbey he had founded decades before. But even in death, peace did not come easily to him. As monks prepared his grave, they discovered that the tomb was too small. The corpse had to be forced inside, and as they did, the body burst, filling the church with a stench so foul that the congregation fled in horror. It was a fitting end for a man whose reign had been both magnificent and merciless. Yet his death marked not an ending, but a fracture. The empire he had forged with such precision was split between his sons. Robert received Normandy, William Rufus took England, and Henry, the youngest, was left with money but no land. Three brothers bound by blood, yet destined for rivalry. William Rufus ruled England with the same iron temper as his father, but none of his restraint. He quarrelled with the church, taxed the nobles harshly, and lived a life of excess that earned him few allies. His reign ended abruptly in 1100, when an arrow struck him during a hunt in the New Forest. Whether by accident or design, no one could say. Some whispered that his younger brother Henry had arranged it, for Henry wasted no time seizing the crown. Within days, he rode to Winchester, secured the royal treasury, and declared himself king. Henry I, as he would be known, was shrewd, literate, and cunning. He married Edith, daughter of the old Anglo-Saxon royal line, in a gesture of reconciliation that soothed both Norman and English hearts. His reign brought stability, law, and a sense of measured strength. He founded schools, expanded royal justice, and oversaw the development of what would become the English common law. Yet his personal life was marked by tragedy. His only legitimate son, William Adelin, drowned in the White Ship disaster of 1120, a single night of drunken celebration that ended with over 300 nobles lost to the sea. Henry never recovered from the loss. The death of his heir left England once again exposed to the spectre of civil war. And when Henry himself died in 1135, the throne passed not to peace, but to chaos. The age of conquest had ended, but the age of conflict between kings, between families, between the very bloodlines of the Norman world had just begun, when Henry I died. His chosen heir was not a son, but a daughter, Matilda, the Empress, widow of the Holy Roman Emperor. It was a bold and unprecedented choice, and many barons swore loyalty to her while Henry still lived. But oaths made in peace dissolve quickly in ambition. The moment Henry's body was laid to rest, his nephew Stephen of Blois raced across the Channel, seized the treasury, and crowned himself King of England. What followed was nearly 2 decades of chaos that chroniclers would later call the Anarchy, a civil war where there was, as one monk wrote, no king, but many tyrants. Castles sprang up like weeds across the countryside as rival lords fortified their power. The land fractured into a patchwork of loyalties, each sworn more to survival than to any throne. Villages burned, crops rotted in the fields, and the people starved while the great families waged private wars under the guise of loyalty. Matilda's forces held the west, Stephen's the southeast, and between them stretched a wasteland of shifting control. In 1141, Matilda's army captured Stephen at the Battle of Lincoln, and for a brief moment it seemed the rightful heir might prevail. But fortune, as always, was fickle. When she entered London to prepare for her coronation, the people rose against her. Her pride and foreign manner had alienated them. Forced to flee under cover of night, she retreated once more to the castles of her supporters. Later that same year, Stephen was freed, and the bloody stalemate resumed. Years passed in exhaustion. Neither side could claim victory, and the realm descended further into ruin. By the mid-1150s, both rivals were weary, and so were their followers. Finally, a compromise emerged. Stephen would remain king for the rest of his life, but upon his death, the crown would pass to Matilda's son, Henry of Anjou, when Stephen died in 1154. That agreement was honored, and the long war ended. Henry, only 21 years old, ascended as Henry II, the first of the Plantagenet kings. The Normans had once conquered England by the sword, but now, through their descendants, they would conquer it again, through law, reform, and royal will. Yet Henry's reign, though brilliant, would prove that even peace built upon compromise carries the seeds of future rebellion. When Henry II took the throne in 1154, England was a scarred and weary kingdom, its fields scorched by war and its people hollowed by famine and fear. Yet, in that broken land, Henry saw not defeat but opportunity. He was a man of towering energy and intellect, fluent in multiple tongues, and possessed of a temper as legendary as his reforms. From his mother Matilda he had inherited pride, and from his father Geoffrey of Anjou the restless cunning of the Plantagenet bloodline. His ambition was nothing less than to rebuild England into an empire of law, order, and unchallengeable royal authority. He began by restoring control over the barons who had grown fat on the chaos of Stephen's reign. Unauthorized castles were torn down, and mercenary bands were driven from the countryside. Justice, long corrupted by local power, was brought back under the crown. Henry's legal reforms would reshape not only England, but the entire Western world. The introduction of royal courts, traveling justices, and written records created the foundations of the common law still used centuries later. Yet Henry was no mere bureaucrat. He was a warrior king, ruling over lands that stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. Through his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, the most powerful woman in Europe, famed for her beauty, intelligence, and defiance, their union bound England to vast French territories, but it also brought two indomitable wills into one uneasy alliance. Together they had sons who would one day be kings and traitors both. But Henry's greatest test came not from barons or armies, but from within his own church. His longtime friend, Thomas Becket, whom he had raised from Chancellor to Archbishop of Canterbury, began to defy him, defending the Church's privileges against the Crown's authority. Their friendship turned to bitter enmity, a struggle between divine law and royal power that would end in blood on the floor of Canterbury Cathedral, as Becket's murderers struck, crying for the king. England trembled once more under the weight of guilt and fury. Henry, haunted by what his words had unleashed, would later crawl barefoot through the streets of Canterbury in penance. But even repentance could not halt the gathering storm, for his sons, raised amid power and rebellion, were watching, and soon they would rise against their father, carrying the Plantagenet curse into the next generation. The sons of Henry II were born into wealth, brilliance, and fury. They were princes, raised in palaces, yet shaped by war, heirs to an empire that stretched from the cold shores of England to the sunlit vineyards of Aquitaine. But what they inherited in land, they lacked in peace. Henry's relentless ambition left little space for affection, and his sons grew to see him not as a father, but as a rival. The eldest, Henry the young king, was crowned during his father's lifetime, a gesture meant to secure the dynasty, but which instead sowed jealousy and pride. Though he bore a crown, he had no real power, and his resentment burned quietly until it erupted in open rebellion. Beside him stood his brothers, Richard, fierce and commanding, and Geoffrey, cunning and ruthless. Even Eleanor of Aquitaine turned against her husband, lending her sons the strength of her vast southern duchy. It was a family consumed by pride, vengeance, and betrayal. The same forces that had made the Normans great now threatened to tear them apart. The rebellion swept through England and France, leaving fortresses in ashes and families divided. Yet Henry, with his unmatched endurance, crushed each uprising, forgiving and punishing in equal measure. But blood once spilled is never forgotten. One by one, his sons betrayed him again, driven by restless ambition and whispers from courtiers who saw opportunity in their division. When Henry the young king died of fever in 1183, the old king's heart hardened, but fate was not yet done with him. Geoffrey died soon after, trampled in a tournament, leaving only Richard and John. Richard, called the Lion, was the embodiment of chivalric glory, bold in battle, adored by his men, but as merciless as any Viking ancestor. John, the youngest, watched and waited, his mind sharper than his sword, his loyalty forever uncertain. When Richard joined the Crusades to the Holy Land, John plotted in the shadows, whispering to enemies and striking alliances while pretending obedience. Henry, now old and exhausted, found himself hunted by his own blood. In 1189, betrayed and dying, he asked to see the list of those who had turned against him, and when he saw his son's name, his strength broke. "Now," he said, "let all things end." And so they did. Henry's dynasty survived, but the man who had forged it was gone, leaving behind a kingdom of splendor, scars, and sons who would shape the legend of England forever. When Richard I took the throne, the world called him Lionheart, a name earned not in halls of council but on blood-soaked fields where steel rang and banners burned beneath foreign suns. He was every inch a warrior king, tall, golden-haired, and terrifying in his wrath, the perfect image of chivalry that poets would sing about for centuries. Yet Richard was not a ruler of peace or governance. He was a man consumed by crusade, driven by a vision of holy war that pulled him far from the shores of England. To his subjects, he was a phantom monarch, glimpsed only through the taxes demanded to fund his campaigns and the rumors, carried by weary ships returning from the east. In 1190, he sailed for the Holy Land, joining the Third Crusade against Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria. Their struggle became the stuff of myth, two titans of faith and strategy locked in a conflict that was as much about honor as conquest. The deserts of Palestine saw Richard's genius and his brutality. His army, disciplined and fearless, won victories that astonished both ally and enemy. Yet even the Lionheart could not reclaim Jerusalem, and the long years of battle drained his treasury and his men. When he finally turned homeward, fate ambushed him. Shipwrecked, captured, and ransomed by the Holy Roman Emperor, Richard became the most expensive prisoner in history. His kingdom paid dearly, a tax so heavy it bent England's back beneath its weight. Still, his legend grew. Ballads painted him as the perfect king, noble, fearless, untouchable, even as his brother John schemed in his absence, weaving alliances with France and betraying those loyal to the crown. When Richard at last returned, vengeance followed. He crushed his brother's plots and turned his wrath on those who had betrayed him, reclaiming his lands and restoring the authority of his name. But the glory of the Lionheart was short. In 1199, while besieging a minor castle in France over a petty dispute of treasure, he was struck by a crossbow bolt. Infection set in, and even kings could not command life to stay. As he lay dying, Richard forgave the boy who had shot him, an act of grace that stunned his men. The Lionheart's final words were for his mother, Eleanor, the last light of his empire. With his death, the age of heroic kings faded. and the shadow of John crept across the throne. John, youngest son of Henry II, stepped into his brother's throne in 1199, not as a hero, but as a man already marked by suspicion. Where Richard was bold and radiant, John was calculating, secretive, and insecure, a ruler who sought control through manipulation rather than valor. His father had called him Lachlan, for he had been given no estates as a boy, and that wound never healed. Now, as king, he seemed determined to seize what the world had once denied him. But John's reign began under a cloud. The nobles who had once served Richard did not trust him. The church doubted him, and France saw in him a weak link ripe for exploitation. The loss began in Normandy, the heart of the Norman identity itself. King Philip II of France, cunning and relentless, exploited John's political blunders and seized vast swathes of his French territories. Castles that had stood since William's time fell one after another, and by 1204 the once mighty Norman Empire in France was gone. England was now isolated, cut off from its continental roots, and John bore the blame. To fund his failed wars, he squeezed his barons with brutal taxes, sold justice to the highest bidder, and extorted the church. When the Pope appointed a new Archbishop of Canterbury without his approval, John retaliated by seizing church lands. The church answered with an interdict, the whole kingdom placed under spiritual lockdown, sacraments suspended, the dead buried in unconsecrated ground. The people murmured that their king was cursed, and for once it seemed true. Even when John made peace with the Pope, his cruelty and paranoia grew. He imprisoned noble families, starved political enemies, and was said to have murdered his own nephew, Arthur, to secure the throne. But tyranny breeds resistance. In 1215, his barons rose against him, forcing the meeting at Runnymede, a field beside the Thames where the Magna Carta was sealed. It was not meant as a revolution, but a restraint, a promise that even a king must obey the law. Yet John, ever faithless, broke it almost immediately, plunging the country into civil war. As rebellion spread and France invaded, John fled through the swamps of eastern England, carrying the crown jewels in a cart that legend says sank into the mud of the Wash, never to be found again. Sick, deserted, and defeated, John died in 1216, leaving behind not triumph, but the bitter legacy of a broken kingdom and the first fragile seeds of English liberty. When John's reign ended, England stood on the edge of collapse. The barons had called in a French prince to take the throne. The treasury was empty, and the Norman legacy seemed ready to vanish into chaos. But out of this turmoil emerged something unexpected, a quiet rebirth. The boy who inherited John's crown was Henry III, only 9 years old, his small frame barely able to carry the weight of the crown. Yet around him gathered men who still believed in the idea of the realm, men who saw that the Norman experiment could not simply vanish but must evolve. Under the guidance of William Marshal, the greatest knight of his age, the young king's guardians reissued the Magna Carta, not as a symbol of rebellion now, but as a foundation for peace. What began as a document of defiance became a charter of governance, a statement that law could outlast any king. Slowly, the realm began to heal. The fusion between Norman and Anglo-Saxon traditions, once a wound of conquest, became the backbone of a new English identity. The old French tongue of the nobles began to mingle with the English of the fields, creating the blended language we speak today. In the halls of Westminster, where Norman stone met Saxon timber, the future of a nation was being quietly written. The knights and clergy who once served as instruments of royal will began to see themselves as representatives of the realm. By the mid-13th century, England was no longer a Norman colony, nor a Saxon remnant. It was becoming something uniquely its own. The long shadow of the conquest had given way to a shared sense of belonging. Norman castles still loomed across the countryside, but their purpose was changing. Once fortresses of domination, they now became symbols of continuity, their cold walls standing not for tyranny, but for endurance. The memory of William's victory and John's tyranny lingered in equal measure, shaping a cautious balance between authority and resistance. This was the paradox of the Norman legacy, that their rule had begun with fire and sword. Yet, from that violence emerged the idea that no power is absolute, that law, not lineage, must govern. As Henry III grew to manhood, he would struggle to keep that idea alive, even as new storms gathered beyond his reach. And so, from the ashes of conquest and the ruins of rebellion, England began to rise again, not as Norman, not as Saxon, but as something altogether new. As Henry III's reign unfolded, the Norman legacy found new expression not on the battlefield but in stone, glass, and devotion. Across England, a transformation began, one that turned the harsh defensive geometry of Norman castles into the soaring grace of Gothic cathedrals. It was as if the realm itself was reaching upward, trading the sword for the spire. Henry, deeply pious and enamored with the glory of France, poured his resources into rebuilding Westminster Abbey, not as a fortress of power, but as a temple of light. The thick Romanesque arches of his Norman forebears gave way to slender ribs, pointed vaults, and windows so vast they seemed to dissolve the walls themselves. Light became the new language of authority. In those shimmering spaces of coloured glass, one could almost feel the echo of Normandy, its builders, its craftsmen, its long tradition of merging art and order. The masons who once built keeps now carved angels and saints, and through their chisels passed the memory of a culture that had learned to blend conquest with creation. Each cathedral, from Canterbury to Lincoln, stood as a bridge between eras, Norman foundations beneath Gothic dreams. The faith that had marched beneath the banners of William now softened into prayer, scholarship, and song. Monasteries, many founded under Norman patronage, became centers of learning where Latin texts were copied and illuminated, their margins filled with strange beasts and tiny knights, echoes of the Norman imagination that had once conquered worlds. Yet within that peace lay tension. The same hands that built cathedrals also built castles, and behind the facade of faith, kings and barons still wrestled for dominance. The church itself had grown powerful, its influence rivaling that of the crown. The Norman experiment to unite faith, law, and power now stood at a crossroads. Still, for the ordinary people who walked beneath those cathedral arches, who watched sunlight filtered through stories of saints and kings, the effect was transformative. For the first time, England felt less like a conquered land and more like a civilization in full bloom. The Normans had arrived as invaders, but through faith and architecture, they had become immortal, their spirit etched not in blood or conquest, but in the very stones that still reach toward the heavens today. While cathedrals reached toward heaven, another revolution was taking root in the quiet chambers of monasteries and the dimly lit halls of early universities. The Normans, who had once measured power by land and steel, began to measure it by knowledge. From Normandy to Oxford, a hunger for understanding spread like fire through parchment. It was here that the seeds of the Western intellectual tradition were sown, not through kings, but through scribes, monks, and scholars who believed that truth could be captured in ink. Under Norman influence, England's monasteries became centers of record-keeping and administration, the silent engines of empire. The Doomsday Book, that vast survey of land and power, had been their earliest triumph, a masterpiece of control through writing. Now, those same instincts turned toward learning. The Norman ruling class, once fluent only in the language of conquest, began to sponsor schools. In Oxford and later Cambridge, students gathered to study theology, logic, and law disciplines that blended Norman practicality with the ancient wisdom of Greece and Rome. The Normans had inherited the organizational rigor of their Viking forebears and the intellectual curiosity of Latin Christendom, and they used both to shape the foundations of Western governance. Latin remained the language of scholarship, but English, once suppressed, began to re-emerge, rough-edged, flexible, alive. From the collision of Norman French and Old English came a new voice, one that could describe not only battles and laws, but dreams and doubts. This linguistic blending gave rise to the earliest English literature, stories that carried both the cadence of the peasant and the precision of the court. And through it all, the Norman love of order persisted. They catalogued, codified, and archived everything they touched, from land deeds to legal arguments to the mysteries of the divine. Their scholars did not see knowledge as rebellion, but as refinement, a way to shape the chaos of the world into a system that could be understood, governed, and, perhaps, transcended. In this world of candles and quills, the Norman legacy found its quietest yet most enduring form, not in the clang of steel, but in the scratch of ink. Every word written in those halls carried within it a fragment of their dual nature, warrior and administrator, conqueror and creator. And as the centuries turned, the ideas they preserved would ignite revolutions far greater than any sword could command. As England found its balance between faith and governance, the Norman spirit turned outward once again, driven by the same restlessness that had carried them from Viking raiders to rulers of kingdoms. By the 12th century, Norman adventurers were no longer content with England and Normandy. They looked to the wider world, to Wales, to Ireland, to Sicily, and even to the shores of the Holy Land. Each conquest carried the same paradox, brutality and refinement intertwined. In Ireland, Norman knights arrived first as mercenaries, invited by warring Irish kings to settle disputes. But like their ancestors before them, once they came, they never left. They built castles on emerald hills, walled towns by the rivers, and imposed their feudal codes on Celtic land. Yet over generations, they too became something new, more Irish than the Irish themselves. As the chroniclers would say, proof again of the Norman gift for adaptation. In Sicily and southern Italy, other Norman families carved out realms from the decaying Byzantine and Arab frontiers. Men like Robert Guiscard and Roger II forged a kingdom that dazzled Europe with its strange beauty, a fusion of Latin, Greek, and Islamic influences. Their palaces glittered with mosaics that mixed Christian saints with Arabic calligraphy, a vision of tolerance rare for the age. The Norman kingdom of Sicily became a crossroads of civilization, a place where scholars translated texts from Arabic into Latin, preserving ancient wisdom that might otherwise have been lost. Some historians call it the first true Renaissance, a meeting of worlds under Norman rule. Even in the Crusades, the Norman name carried weight. They marched under the cross, but fought with the cunning of old sea raiders, carving out territories in Antioch and Jerusalem. Wherever they went, they left their mark, not just walls and laws, but a pattern of integration, of bending foreign customs to their own and, in turn, reshaping themselves. It was as though the Norman identity depended on movement, on the tension between belonging and conquest. They were never still long enough to become only one thing. Their empire was not a single territory, but a series of echoes, the same pattern repeated in different lands, each time adjusted, refined, reborn. And as the 13th century unfolded, it seemed that the Normans, though fading as a distinct people, had seeded the future with their restless ambition, a legacy that would outlive their name. Long after the Norman dukes and kings had passed into legend, their most enduring creation lived on, not in castles or crowns, but in the invisible architecture of law. What the Normans built was not merely a government. It was a system of control so intricate and disciplined that it could survive its makers. The Doomsday Book had been its first expression, a meticulous catalogue of power, but over time, it evolved into something far more profound, the concept of rule by law rather than by will. Norman justice was harsh, pragmatic, and absolute, but it carried the seeds of accountability. They introduced written charters, recorded judgments, and standardized procedures. They turned the king's word into precedent and the court's decisions into a kind of memory that could be referred to again and again. Out of this grew the foundation of the English common law, a living system that adapted and endured, unlike the rigid codes of the continent. It was a strange paradox that a people known for conquest had created the framework for fairness. Even Magna Carta, born in rebellion against King John, drew heavily from Norman legal customs. Its clauses on trial by jury, on taxation, on the rights of freemen, echoed the administrative rigor of Norman governance. Over centuries, these principles would ripple outward, shaping not just England, but the political conscience of the Western world. From the Magna Carta came the idea that no ruler stands above the law, and from that idea would one day emerge parliaments, constitutions, and human rights. The Norman genius lay in their ability to codify power, to take the chaos of rule and give it form. Bureaucracy, record-keeping, and written law became the tools of empire, allowing authority to persist beyond personality. Even their concept of land tenure, the feudal hierarchy that divided England into ordered obligations, left a permanent mark on the way societies understood property and governance. And while their castles eventually crumbled, the legal systems they inspired became stronger with time, carried across oceans by colonists and reformers. In the courtrooms of London, Washington, and Canberra, echoes of Norman Latin still linger in the language of justice. They had conquered kingdoms, but their true dominion was more subtle, a conquest of minds, of systems, of structure itself. The sword had won them the world, but the pen ensured they would never be forgotten, long after their banners vanished, and their bloodlines dissolved into the royal houses of Europe. The Normans left behind something that refused to fade: their architecture. Their mastery of stone became their language, their permanence. Even now, across England and northern France, the ghost of their ambition lingers in towers, keeps, and cathedrals. Walk through the great nave of Durham Cathedral and you can still feel their presence. Massive pillars rising like the trunks of a forest, carved with spirals that seem to twist the light itself. The air smells of damp stone and candle wax. The sound of footsteps echoes endlessly beneath the high vaults. It was not merely a place of worship, it was a statement of power. Every arch, every carved capital, every thick wall whispered of control, endurance, divine authority. The Norman builders knew how to command space, how to turn architecture into ideology. Their castles, like the White Tower in London or Rochester Keep, were not just fortresses, but symbols of psychological dominance. When a villager saw those walls rising above the fields, he was reminded of who ruled him and of how impossible rebellion would be. Yet over time, these structures softened, their meanings changed. Monks prayed in the chapels, once guarded by swordsmen. Children played in the courtyards where knights once rode. The same stones that had once been tools of fear became monuments of beauty. Their Romanesque designs evolved into Gothic grace, the weight of conquest transforming into the elegance of faith. Even in Sicily, in Palermo's palaces and Monreal's golden mosaics, the Norman aesthetic blended with Arabic artistry. Patterns, colors, and light fusing in a harmony no other conquerors ever achieved. It was as if the Normans built not merely for their own time, but for all times to come. Their architecture became a form of immortality. Each tower, each church, each bridge became a silent witness to their paradox. Warriors who built, invaders who preserved, conquerors who created. And though centuries have weathered their work, the spirit behind it still breathes in the stone. When you walk beneath those vaulted ceilings or touch the cool surface of a Norman wall, you are touching the ambition of a people who refused to vanish, who carved their story, quite literally, into the bones of the world. As the centuries turned and the medieval world faded into the dawn of modernity, the Normans themselves disappeared, not through defeat, but through absorption. Their language merged with English, their customs became English law, their nobility became the English aristocracy. What had begun as a foreign rule was now indistinguishable from the realm itself. The conquerors had become the country. Yet even in vanishing, they achieved something extraordinary. They became a myth. Chroniclers and poets began to weave their story into legend. The daring knights, the great castles, the unstoppable Duke William who changed a nation with a single battle. In the imagination of Europe, the Normans ceased to be mere warriors and became symbols of destiny, of transformation, of civilization forged through conquest. But memory has a way of reshaping truth. The brutality of the invasion softened in retellings, replaced by tales of chivalry and divine purpose. The English began to look upon their Norman past not as an open wound, but as a foundation. The myths of kingship, of law, of noble lineage, all found their roots in that first victory at Hastings. And beyond England, the Norman name echoed differently. In Sicily, it meant tolerance and brilliance. In France, it meant ambition and defiance. In Ireland, it meant intrusion and change. Each region remembered them through its own lens, as both builders and destroyers. Historians of later centuries wrestled with their legacy. Were they civilizers or colonizers? Innovators or users? The truth, as always, lay between extremes. The Normans were both the shadow and the light, the bridge between the barbaric past and the structured world that would follow. By the time the Renaissance arrived, their direct bloodline had faded, but their influence remained embedded in every institution, every cathedral, every word of law. The idea of the Norman disciplined, adaptable, relentless, lived on as a kind of archetype, a model for what power could become when tempered by intellect. They were no longer people but principles, and though their bones have long since turned to dust, their presence lingers in the very idea of the West, in the belief that chaos can be shaped into order, that conquest can give way to creation, that even the fiercest storm can become the foundation of a new world. And so, as we reach the end of the Norman story, what remains is not simply history, but resonance, an echo carried across 1,000 years, from the beaches of Normandy to the cathedrals of England, from the courts of Sicily to the parliaments of the modern world. Their spirit endures like a vibration beneath the surface of everything we call civilization. They began as Vikings raiders who took what they wanted by fire and blade, yet they ended as architects of order, masters of law, visionaries of governance and art. Their journey was the story of transformation itself, how raw power becomes discipline, how conquest becomes culture. Even today, the fingerprints of their rule can be traced in the systems that govern us, in the idea of justice, in the architecture that defines our cities, in the very notion of what it means to rule. When you hear the word kingdom, when you walk through a courtroom, when you see the silhouette of a castle against a fading sky, you are standing inside their legacy. It is the strange magic of the Normans that they could vanish as a people, but never as a force. Their influence is not a relic of the past. It is a structure still standing, invisible yet unbroken. Every law written, every document sealed, every idea that power must answer to law, all of it began with them. And yet, their story is more than one of triumph. It is a reminder of fragility. For all their brilliance, their empire dissolved not through conquest, but through assimilation. Power is never eternal. The Normans remind us that even the strongest must adapt or fade. And perhaps that is their greatest gift, not their castles, nor their kings, but their example. They showed that survival belongs to those who evolve, that legacy is not preserved in bloodlines but in ideas. The Normans are gone, yet they remain everywhere, in the pages of history, in the stones of our cities, in the quiet assumptions of how the world should be ordered. Their story began with the roar of invasion and ends with the whisper of endurance. It is the sound of history breathing through time, the echo that never ends, reminding us that power, like memory, does not die, it only changes form.